So King Charles just handed Princess Anne a level of formal institutional power that has literally no modern precedent, and the way it happened tells you everything about who he actually trusts and what he thinks is coming next. The document itself is called the Palace Order, and if you're not deep into royal constitutional mechanics, that might just sound like some fancy paperwork. It's not. A palace order properly issued by a reigning monarch is essentially irreversible without that monarch's explicit consent. It sits in a category of royal instruments that goes back centuries, older than letters patent, older than the mechanisms people normally talk about when they discuss royal authority. And Charles didn't just approve this casually. He directed its preparation through his private office and his constitutional advisors, reviewed multiple drafts over about 3 weeks, and then signed the final version in a private ceremony attended only by his private secretary, his principal legal advisor, and the person the order was addressed to, that person was Princess Anne, his sister, the woman who has arguably worked harder and complained less than anyone else in that family for 50 years. Before we get into what's actually in this order and why it matters, real quick, if you want more royal analysis and breakdowns like this, hit subscribe to Crown Watch. We're covering all of this as it develops. Okay, back to it. So what does the order actually grant? 4 specific categories of authority, and when you look at them together, the scope is genuinely staggering. The first category is oversight authority over the royal household's most sensitive institutional review processes. We're talking about the management and protection of royal heritage assets, private estates, the personal property of the crown, and can now initiate, conduct, and conclude institutional reviews in these areas without needing the monarch's prior approval for each individual action. She doesn't have to go to Charles and say, "Can I look into this?" She can just do it, reach her own conclusions, and implement them through the household's formal channels on her own authority, not as a delegated representative, as a principal. The second category is constitutional, and this one's important. Anne has been formally designated as a senior counselor of state, with expanded responsibilities that go way beyond the traditional counselor role. Traditionally, counselors of state can perform limited functions when the monarch is unavailable. Anne's new designation gives her a broader range of functions and more significant institutional standing than any counselor of state has held in the modern era. That's not an exaggeration. That's what the document does. The third category involves the royal family's private archives and sensitive historical records. Anne now has formal authority over the classification, preservation, and controlled release of materials that the monarch designates as institutionally sensitive. This connects directly to the Diana correspondence review that she and William initiated earlier in 2026. She's not just helping with that review, she now has formal standing to oversee exactly that kind of material. And the fourth category might be the most significant day-to-day. Anne can now represent the crown in certain official engagements and communications that have historically required the direct participation of the monarch or the heir. She can speak for the institution with the full formal weight of royal authority, not as a proxy who needs subsequent ratification, as a principal. Again, that word keeps coming up because it's the word that matters. Individually, each of these is a meaningful expansion. Together, sources inside the palace are using words like genuinely historic. There has not been a grant of this breadth of formal institutional authority to a non-heir member of the royal family in living memory, possibly not in the history of the modern constitutional monarchy. So the question everyone inside that building has been sitting with is why? Why this scope? Why this moment? Why Anne specifically? And why now? Part of the answer is visible in the circumstances of the current reign. Charles is managing a serious illness while navigating one of the most turbulent institutional periods the monarchy has faced in decades. William is expanding into an increasingly dominant role, but he carries the specific political sensitivities of being the heir apparent rather than the monarch. Every move he makes invites questions about succession and transition. The household needs, in practical terms, someone with formal authority to act decisively across a range of institutional functions without the complications that either Charles's health or William's position introduce. Anne fills that need with a completeness that nobody else in the family could match. She has the seniority, the institutional knowledge, the trust of both Charles and William, the temperament, and a 5-decade track record of serious, disciplined, unsentimental royal service. Giving her significant authority doesn't feel like an unusual step. It feels like a long overdue recognition of capacity that's always been there. But the practical need alone doesn't explain the full scope. because the scope extends into areas that will remain relevant long after the immediate crises resolve. That extension suggests Charles was thinking about something beyond the present when he signed this. What he was thinking about connects directly to private conversations he's been having about the kind of monarchy he wants to leave behind. To understand why Anne, you have to understand the relationship between these two people, which goes way deeper than the formal sibling bond of two royals. They're the two eldest children of Queen Elizabeth II. They grew up together inside a household that was, by every account, considerably more formal and less emotionally expressive than most people can imagine. Elizabeth and Philip were devoted parents in their own way, but they were also a reigning monarch and a senior royal duke whose public obligations consumed enormous amounts of time and attention. Charles and Anne navigated that environment differently. Charles internalized the pressures shaped toward introspection and sensitivity in this elaborate emotional interior life. Anne developed the hard outer surface of someone who decided early that survival meant meeting demands head-on, without complaint, without self-pity, without expecting anyone to acknowledge how difficult it actually was. That difference in temperament has sometimes created distance between them. They're not a brother and sister who speak daily or share every confidence, but it's also created a specific kind of mutual respect that's more durable than affection because it's based on genuine recognition of each other's capabilities. Charles respects Anne in a way he respects very few people. He respects her judgment, her consistency, the fact that across 5 decades of public service, she has never once put her own interests ahead of the institutions, never created a scandal that required management, never placed a personal relationship or private ambition above what the crown required. In the current climate, with the institution navigating the most serious combination of pressures it's faced in a generation, that track record isn't just admirable, it's operationally essential. Charles needed to place significant formal authority in someone he could trust completely, someone whose judgment he was confident in, someone whose institutional loyalty was beyond question. When he assessed the field of available people with those criteria, the answer was unambiguous. It was Anne. The timing connects directly to Charles's health in a way the palace has been careful not to state explicitly, but sources close to the household describe with consistent clarity. The weeks before the order signing included a period of more acute health concern that prompted Charles and his medical team to have a specific conversation, not about treatment options or prognosis in a dramatic sense, but about the practical reality of managing the responsibilities of a reigning monarch through a period of illness whose trajectory remained uncertain. That conversation produced a practical conclusion. There were institutional functions that needed to be performed with full formal authority that Charles couldn't guarantee he'd always be in a position to perform himself. William could take on some of those functions. He'd been taking on more across the preceding 18 months, but William's position as heir apparent introduced a specific constitutional sensitivity. When the heir apparent acts on behalf of the monarch, every action carries an implicit question about succession and transition. It invites speculation, generates commentary, gets read by the press and the public and foreign governments through the lens of a king in waiting rather than a king in office. That reading creates complications that aren't always manageable. When Anne acts, none of that applies. She's not in the line of succession in any practical sense. She's not being positioned as a successor. She's the Princess Royal, the King's sister, an experienced and trusted senior royal performing functions she's been formally authorized to perform. The institutional clarity of that position is genuinely valuable right now. Charles also factored in something more personal. He factored in the specific institutional landscape developing inside the palace across the preceding months. The challenges around Camilla's inner circle, the situations involving Tom Parker Bowles, the ongoing management of the Andrew fallout, the Diana correspondence review, all of these require the kind of decisive and unsentimental institutional action that Charles knows Anne is capable of and has seen her exercise with considerable effectiveness. By granting her formal authority to act in these areas as a principal rather than an advisor, he's given her the institutional standing that matches the role she was already playing informally. He's made the formal reality catch up with the operational one, and he's done something else that those close to him described as characteristically thoughtful. He's created a counterbalance, not to William exactly. Their relationship is too aligned and mutually respectful, for counterbalance to be the right word, more like a complement. A figure of formal authority operating alongside William, whose presence provides a form of continuity and a form of check that serves the monarchy's long-term stability in ways that go beyond any single current crisis. Anne understood all of this when Charles presented the order to her. Sources close to her describe a woman who accepted it without the false modesty of someone performing reluctance. She understood why she was being asked, she understood what would be required, and she said yes with the quiet, complete certainty of someone who had been preparing for exactly this kind of responsibility for most of her adult life. Whether she anticipated the full scope is a different question. Sources suggest even Anne was surprised by how far it went, so that's where it gets interesting with William. The first question every senior figure inside the palace had when the scope of Anne's new authority became known was straightforward. How does this sit with William? Because in any institutional landscape where authority is being distributed, the position of the heir apparent is the one that matters most in the hierarchy. Any significant grant of authority to another royal inevitably raises the question of whether it complements the heir's position or complicates it. The answer here is neither entirely one nor entirely the other. It's more nuanced. William has been expanding into an increasingly dominant institutional role throughout this period. His involvement in the major decisions of the reign, the handling of Andrew, the management of palace heritage assets, the shaping of the decree governing Camilla's future, has been consistent, significant, and growing. He's not simply the heir apparent waiting in the wings. He's by every operational measure the co-architect of the monarchy's current direction. But that expanding role carries a specific tension William has been aware of and managing carefully. The tension between acting with the authority the current situation demands and being seen to act with authority that formally belongs to a king who is still alive and still reigning. It's a tension with no perfect resolution. Every significant move William makes invites commentary about overstepping. Every decision he drives generates questions about the relative positions of father and son and whether Charles is being managed rather than supported. Anne's formal authority resolves part of that tension in a way that's genuinely useful to William. By having a formally designated senior figure operating alongside him with explicitly granted institutional authority, the appearance of William acting unilaterally as a de facto king is replaced by something more accurate and more manageable. The palace has a formally authorized institutional structure that includes multiple senior figures acting within their defined remits. William is one, Anne is another. Charles remains the monarch. The distribution of formal authority across these three figures reflects the operational reality of the current reign in a way the previous informal arrangements didn't. Sources close to William describe his response to Anne's elevation as genuinely positive. Not the performed positivity of someone managing a difficult situation, but the authentic response of someone who recognizes that what Charles did is institutionally intelligent and personally well-judged. He trusts Anne. He's demonstrated that trust through his willingness to act jointly with her on some of the most sensitive institutional matters of the past year. The Diana Correspondence Review was the most visible expression of that joint action. But it wasn't the only one. Sources confirm William has been consulting Anne regularly and substantively across a range of institutional matters, treating her not as a senior relative whose views are to be respected, but as a genuine partner in the practical work of managing the monarchy's current challenges. The formal authority Charles has granted, Anne doesn't change that dynamic. It formalizes it. It gives institutional standing to a working relationship that had already demonstrated its value and its effectiveness. And it does so in a way that strengthens rather than complicates William's own position by surrounding him with a clearly defined institutional structure rather than leaving him as the sole visible locus of expanding authority. There is one area where the relationship between Anne's new authority and William's position requires more careful navigation. That area involves the constitutional category of Anne's expanded Counselor of State designation. The expansion of Counselor of State functions to the breadth Charles has granted creates a formal institutional presence that sits between the monarch and the heir in certain specific constitutional contexts. In practice, there are functions Anne can now perform with full formal authority that William cannot perform without raising succession sensitivities. She can act in certain official capacities as a principal. He acts in those same capacities as an heir. The formal standing those two positions carry is different in ways that matter in specific constitutional contexts, even when the practical outcome is identical. William understands this distinction. He's not threatened by it. He recognizes that the specific constitutional value of Anne's position is precisely that it does not carry the succession implications his own position does. Her authority is bounded in specific ways that ensure it doesn't extend into the areas most directly connected to the succession. It operates within those bounds with full formal weight, and within those bounds it's genuinely useful to the institutional structure in ways that William's own authority, given the sensitivities of his position, cannot be. What emerges from all of this is a picture of a monarchy operating with a degree of institutional sophistication that the public narrative around royal family drama doesn't always capture. Behind the headlines about confrontations and decrees and power struggles, there's a serious and considered process of institutional design underway, a process in which Charles, despite his illness and despite the personal difficulties of his current position, is making careful and consequential decisions about the formal structures that will carry the institution through the transition from his reign to William's. Anne's elevation is part of that process. William's expanding role is part of that process. And the relationship between the two complementary, rather than competitive, formally structured rather than informally negotiated, represents the clearest expression yet of what Charles wants the monarchy he leaves behind to look like. Whether the people outside the carefully designed structure, the people whose interests and ambitions it's partly designed to contain, will accept the boundaries it establishes is the question the palace is now sitting with. And that question begins with Camilla. There are things that happen inside the British royal family that Camilla has learned across 20 years of navigating its internal landscape to absorb without visible reaction. She's developed the particular skill of the long-term royal insider, the ability to receive information that is personally difficult, institutionally significant, and potentially threatening to her position, and to process it internally while presenting the composed and untroubled face of someone entirely at ease with the direction events are taking. That skill was tested more seriously by the news of Anne's palace order than by almost anything that had preceded it. Camilla learned about the order in the same way she'd learned about several of the most significant institutional developments of the preceding months, after the fact, through channels that reflected her diminishing position inside the decision-making structures of a household being deliberately reorganized around a different set of priorities and a different set of trusted figures. She was not consulted. She was not informed in advance. She was not given the courtesy of preparation that might have allowed her to position herself appropriately before the information became more widely known inside the household. She was told quietly and briefly by a member of Charles's staff who had been instructed to inform her as a matter of courtesy, rather than as the opening of a conversation. The order had been signed. Anne's authority had been formally granted. The institutional landscape had shifted. And Camilla's response to that shift was, as far as the official household was concerned, a matter for her private processing rather than any ongoing institutional discussion. Sources close to Camilla describe her immediate response as controlled in the way that suppressed reactions are controlled, not calm. Controlled. There's a difference that those who know her well can recognize. Calm is the absence of strong feeling. Controlled is the presence of strong feeling, being deliberately managed. And what she was managing in those first hours was a reaction that sources suggest was considerably more significant than anything she'd allowed to surface in response to previous institutional developments. Because Anne's elevation represented something qualitatively different from the other moves reshaping the palace landscape. The removal of her advisors had been painful, but confined to her immediate circle. The decree had been personally devastating, but concerned her future rather than her present. The Sandringham confrontation had involved her son and created institutional documentation that concerned her deeply. But all of those things remained within the boundaries of situations explicable in terms of specific incidents and specific responses to specific behaviors. Anne's new authority was different. It wasn't a response to anything Camilla had done. It wasn't connected to any specific incident or pattern of behavior on her part or her family's part. It was a fundamental restructuring of the institutional hierarchy around her in a way that elevated a figure whose relationship with Camilla has always been at best one of cool mutual acknowledgement rather than genuine warmth. And it was done with the full formal weight of a historic palace order carrying the monarch's absolute authority. What it meant in the most direct institutional terms was that Anne now held formal authority over several categories of institutional function directly relevant to the most sensitive matters affecting Camilla's position. The oversight authority over royal heritage assets connected directly to the situations involving Tom Parker Bowles, the authority over sensitive historical records connected directly to the Diana Correspondence Review that Anne and William had jointly initiated. The expanded Council of State functions connected directly to the constitutional framework within which Camilla's own formal position as Queen Consort existed. Anne now had formal institutional standing in precisely the areas where the most significant challenges to Camilla's position and her family's conduct had been concentrated. She wasn't simply a senior royal whose views carried weight. She was a formally authorized principal whose decisions in these areas carried the full backing of a historic palace order signed by the reigning monarch. Camilla went to Charles. That's confirmed by sources close to the household. She went to him privately and raised her concerns directly and personally, the way only a wife can raise concerns with a husband. She asked why the order had been granted at this scope. She asked why she hadn't been consulted or informed in advance. And she asked with a directness that sources describe as unusually unguarded for someone who normally manages these conversations with considerable diplomatic care, whether he understood what Anne's new authority meant for her own position inside the household. Charles listened. He received her concerns with the gentleness of a man who understood their personal weight and felt the human cost of the situation she was navigating. And then he said something that sources describe as leaving Camilla in silence for a long moment before she responded. He told her that the order reflected the institutional needs of the monarchy at this specific moment, that Anne's authority was not directed at Camilla personally and should not be understood as such, and that the decisions he'd been making in recent months about the decree, about the household restructuring, about Anne's elevation, were decisions he had made as a king thinking about the institution's future, rather than as a husband acting against his wife's interests. He told her in terms that were gentle but absolutely clear that the institution came first, that it always had, that this was something she had known when she married him, and that the decisions he was making in the final chapter of his reign were the most important expression of that priority he had ever been required to make. Camilla left that conversation without the reassurance she had gone looking for. And the palace in the days that followed continued its reorganization with the quiet, purposeful momentum of an institution that has decided on its direction and is no longer waiting for everyone to be comfortable with it. When you pull back from the immediate drama and look at what Charles has actually done in historical terms, it's genuinely remarkable. The modern British monarchy has been organized since at least the reign of George V in the early 20th century around a specific principle of concentrated authority. The monarch holds the formal power. The heir apparent is positioned as successor. Other members of the royal family, however senior and respected, operate in supporting roles whose formal institutional weight is deliberately limited to prevent competing power centers within the household. That principle has been maintained across multiple reigns with considerable consistency. Even figures of enormous personal authority, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, Princess Margaret, Princess Anne herself in the decades before this order, operated within formal structures that kept their authority subordinate to the monarch and clearly distinct from the heir. The system was designed to prevent exactly the kind of fragmentation of royal authority that has historically caused institutional instability in monarchies across Europe. What Charles has done with this palace order is the most significant departure from that organizing principle in the modern era. He's created, formally and with full constitutional weight, a figure of genuine institutional authority who sits alongside the monarch and the heir rather than below them. Not in the succession, not as a competing center of power in the dynastic sense, but as a formally authorized principle with specific categories of authority that are her own rather than delegated from the monarch on a case-by-case basis. That is genuinely new. Constitutional historians briefed on the order's contents describe it as something that requires reaching back considerably further than the modern era to find a real precedent. The closest historical comparisons involve regency arrangements and the formal elevation of senior royals during periods of monarchical incapacity in the pre-constitutional era. None of those comparisons map cleanly onto the current situation. What Charles has done is, in the most precise sense, something that hasn't been done before in the form he's chosen to do it. That historical novelty matters beyond academic interest because it tells you how seriously Charles views the current institutional situation. A king managing a stable reign with normal challenges wouldn't reach for an instrument this unusual. A king who felt the future was adequately covered by existing arrangements wouldn't create new ones of this significance. The scope of what Charles has granted Anne is itself a measure of the scale of what he believes the monarchy needs right now. He believes it needs more than one formally authorized figure capable of acting with full institutional weight across the range of challenges the palace is navigating. He believes the heir apparent position, however much William has grown into it, carries constitutional sensitivities that limit its operational utility in certain specific contexts. He believes Anne has both the capability and the credibility to fill those gaps. And he believes that formalizing her authority now, while he's still reigning and able to do it with the full constitutional legitimacy of a sitting monarch, is considerably better than leaving institutional gaps to be addressed informally or incompletely after he's gone. That last consideration is the one sources suggest weighed most heavily in Charles's thinking. He's a man making decisions about the institution he'll leave behind. Every significant formal action he takes in this period of his reign is shaped by the awareness that he's building something that needs to function effectively without him. The decree governing Camilla's future was part of that. Anne's palace order is part of that. The systematic restructuring of the household's management structures and accountability frameworks that William has been driving is part of that. Taken together, these actions represent a coherent institutional vision for a post-Charles monarchy. A monarchy with clear formal structures, defined authorities, documented boundaries, a future king in William, whose role is formally supported by a senior figure in Anne with her own explicitly granted authority, a household whose informal power structures have been systematically addressed and whose management of sensitive institutional matters has been placed in the hands of people whose loyalty, judgment, and commitment to the institution's interests have been demonstrated rather than assumed. For Anne, the months ahead will involve the practical exercise of the authority she's been granted in ways that will test and define what that authority means in operational terms. The Diana Correspondence Review remains ongoing. The institutional audit of royal property, access, and management that William initiated continues. The broader restructuring of the household underway across the preceding 18 months hasn't concluded. In all of these areas, Anne's new formal authority gives her a standing that will shape how they develop and how they conclude. Sources close to Anne describe a woman who has approached these responsibilities with the same characteristic combination of seriousness and pragmatism that has defined her entire royal life. She's not performing the weight of what she's been given. She's not making public statements about its significance or giving interviews about her expanded role. She's simply doing the work, attending the meetings, reading the documents, making the decisions her new authority empowers her to make, and moving forward with the quiet, purposeful efficiency that has always been her most defining institutional quality. For William, the period ahead involves the continued development of the working relationship with Anne that the palace order has now formalized. Sources describe that relationship as one of the most genuinely functional and genuinely productive inside the current royal household. Two people with complementary capabilities and completely aligned institutional priorities working together with the trust and effectiveness that the formal authority structure Charles has created now supports and protects. For Camilla, the period ahead involves navigating a palace landscape in which the formal authority structures have been reorganized in ways that reduce her informal influence and constrain her options in the specific areas where she has most consistently sought to extend her reach. She retains her title, she retains her formal position as queen consort for as long as Charles reigns, she retains the public profile she's built and the genuine respect that profile has earned. But the institutional world around her has been redesigned by Charles, by William, and now formally and with historic precedent-setting authority by the palace order that placed Anne at the center of the monarchy's most consequential institutional functions. What Charles has built in these final months of his reign isn't simply a crisis management structure for the immediate challenges the palace faces. It's an institutional architecture designed to outlast him, to carry the monarchy through the transition from his reign to William's with the formal clarity and formal accountability that he believes the institution needs to survive and thrive in the generation ahead. He's done it quietly, deliberately, and with the kind of long-term institutional thinking that those who know him best have always believed was his greatest underappreciated quality. The historic palace order granting Princess Anne her extraordinary new authority is the clearest expression yet of that quality, and its consequences for the British monarchy will be felt long after the immediate stories that surround it have faded from the headlines. Charles didn't make this decision lightly. He made it because the institution required it, and because he trusted the person he chose completely. Princess Anne has spent 5 decades earning exactly this moment, and the monarchy she now helps to protect is better positioned for the future because of it.